Hi, everybody. Thank you so much again for joining us for this Drawdown Georgia Climate Interview Series. My name is Eriqah Vincent, and I'm so glad to be joined today by a sister in the work, somebody I deeply admire, Melanie Allen, co-director of the Hive Fund. We're going to have a great conversation today to talk about philanthropy, which for some people it can be an uncomfortable conversation, but I think is super important to the work that we're doing here in Georgia when it comes to all the climate solutions that we are trying to implement. So thank you so much, Melanie, for being here. I really appreciate it. And I would love for you to start out with telling folks about yourself and then telling folks a little bit about the work that the Hive Fund is doing around climate and gender justice in the Southeast.
Well, thank you, Erica. It is a pleasure to be here and always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And I'm really grateful to Drawdown Georgia for this opportunity. As you said, my name is Melanie Allen, and alongside Aaron Rogers, I am one of the founding co-directors of the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice. One of the things that makes me so excited to do the work that I do, getting up every day, is that I get to do it right here at home. I spend a lot of time in Georgia, but I am from and based in North Carolina, based here in Durham, and have always, I think, because of the way that I've been raised and nurtured here, but also because I grew up as a movement baby, seen and been appreciative of the strong force and social movements here in the South, everything from the civil rights movement to seeing so much around immigration and gender justice movement play out here. And, the really rich communities that have envisioned and then created the world that they like to see, sometimes in small places that they own and manage that are small communities, but so often, and we've all been the beneficiaries in ways that impact our communities more broadly and even the state and the world. And so it's a gift, an honor, and a pleasure to get to do this work at the Hive Fund, where we raise money and make grants to folks who are really the stewards of that work. They are pushing us forward, moving towards two twin goals: helping to accelerate an equitable transition to cleaner, more renewable energy, and then helping to accelerate the phase out of polluting energy and polluting industries that have for too long been our neighbors and just impacted and shaped the way that so many of us have lived. I came into this work in particular through my own personal health struggles. And so the work of combating pollution, but also being in conversation with people who have had experiences that have just impacted their lives, be it asthma or worsening health conditions, to meet other people who have their same stories and not to have to look at it as a singular story, but beginning to see it as something that is happening on a systems level and something that they collectively can take action to change is really, really exciting. And I never thought that at 14, when I started doing this work based on my own health issues, I didn't even know about the job that I have now, let alone think that I would be in this seat. But it is such an honor and a privilege every day, not only to get to hear the stories, but to be in a position to raise money and make grants to folks that are doing the work day in and day out to shape our lives.
Thank you so much for Melanie for telling that story. And thank you for telling that kind of history of yourself. I didn't know that you had started that work at 14. And I'm thinking a lot these days about kind of the health of ourselves, but of our children. We just found out recently that my daughter has asthma right now. We don't know if she's going to grow out of it, but it's something that even though I would have done this work for some time, it's something that's like reignited the thought of how is our environment affecting our health. So it's really nice to hear that from you and to think about that in the context of the work that we're doing, really the people aspect of it without all the additional noise, but like, how does that affect the people? So, like I said, philanthropy is a big word and is a very interesting, people have a lot of interesting feelings about philanthropy, myself included, as someone who's done nonprofit work. And I know you're very familiar with those feelings. I would love to hear from you as someone who does philanthropy work, but also Hive Fund is an intermediary. So I'd love for folks to hear from you kind of what role is philanthropy currently playing in scaling climate solutions and advancing equity? Are we doing more? Are we doing it well? Could we do it better? And in what ways? I'd love to hear your take on that kind of in the very interesting space that you hold as an intermediary funder.
We could talk for a whole week about philanthropy as a whole. I'll start because honestly, like I worked in the nonprofit sector and like knew that we were writing grants, but didn't really understand philanthropy as a whole sector. So I'll start there. And my introduction to philanthropy, like so many people's introduction, was like smaller scale person to person philanthropy.
Mm.
Um, I'm someone who grew up in the church, and when it was time for me to go to high school, people put their dollars together and I ended up with a scholarship that helped me buy books to college. I
Right.
grew up, fish fries and car washes that helped either, send your school on a field trip or even that helped contribute to scholarships as well. And so I think particularly in the South, we're really familiar with folks putting their money together to help individuals or even to, support something that they believe in. I think when I think of philanthropy as a sector, sometimes that can get lost in all of it, that the core of it is helping people. And so I always try to root in the fact that, I think philanthropy comes from the Greek word that means like love of humanity. And so that's the root of it.
Mhm.
And there is a real and storied and complicated history
Yes.
of philanthropy. And so I think when we think of it in the US context and what this system and sector has grown to be, it has really been a place where wealthy folks have been able to park their money. I
Mm.
think, particularly as I think about my ancestors, as I think about a lot of folks I know, it's money that was seen as like, oh, we have excess. And so we put it in philanthropy and we're doing good.
Mm.
But I think depending on your economic frame of the world, and mine tells me that it's probably not excess money. Those are dollars that probably, could have or should have gone to wages or come from exploitation or extraction in one way or another. But it is the system that we have. And I think particularly where we are in this moment, it is an exciting one because we're living through a change. I remember when the Hive Fund started at 2019, it was right when we had all these reports coming out about the largest transition of wealth in the history of the United States and how for the first time there were so many women who were going to be in decision-making control of their family's wealth and, just opportunities to have different people in positions to make decisions. I'm in what you call an intermediary. I started, my first job in philanthropy was at the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, which is a North Carolina-based foundation that funds across the South that comes from tobacco money. And so they had an endowment that over decades continues to grow, and their grant dollars come by allotting a segment of that endowment that they'll put out in grants every single year. I learned so much in that role. It was a very different role because we knew what we were going to have. Maybe the stock market went up or down, and next year kind
Right.
of people would either decide that we're going to dip into the dollars to keep our giving even, but the money was there. An intermediary is a fund that does not have an endowment, which means that like most nonprofits, we raise every dollar that we grant.
Right.
You can think of us as a nonprofit, but our main programmatic work is making grants. So it's kind of you're raising money on one side to make grants on the other. It's a really interesting place to be because we are still a philanthropic organization. We make grants, folks do grant reports, and there are those relationships as well. I think we're also really sensitive and feeling a lot of the same trends that a lot of our partners are feeling. So if people are giving less grants or smaller grants or beginning to shift away from one issue or another, then we're experiencing that in real time with our partners. But we're also often, I think, with other philanthropic folks looked at as peers. And in a situation where we may get to have different conversations and help shape people's view or understanding of an issue and how they might move grants. And so we like to call it the messy middle between movement and money. And it is indeed messy because, we talk about philanthropy and the good that it can do. And I think that there's so much good that has been done and that can be done. But there are also, the history of philanthropic practices where dollars and the way that people fund has seeded competition. And so one of the things that we do at the Hive Fund is we fund what we call ecosystems, which is we're not choosing one group and saying, hey, this complex issue of climate change, we think you're the special group that's going to be able to solve this complex issue that requires really all of our hands on deck. And so it's really important for us to fund an ecosystem, to fund multiple strategies, but also to fund collaborative infrastructure that creates opportunities for folks to be in conversation and work together to achieve progress instead of feeling like they have to take credit for everything that's happened in Atlanta or Georgia or Savannah in order to know that they have some security in their next grant.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm so glad you mentioned, because that was my next question to you. My follow-up question to you was telling people how the Hive Fund works. I deeply admire the way the Hive Fund works with your partners because it doesn't feel transactional. It doesn't feel, in a way where I think in some ways philanthropy has been set up before of like, we give you the money, you send us the grant report, we decide if we're going to fund you again. But it's very much like, not only do we give you the money, but what do you need? How do we build community with you all? How do we connect you to other organizations that might be grantees or might not be grantees of ours, but that we're connected to so that you all can all get what you need and you can build partnerships there? And a lot of the camaraderie, I think, that the Hive Fund creates is really beautiful because it creates, even though it's giving dollars, it creates a community of organizations, definitely in Georgia. And I know you all have that in other places. I know you all work in the Gulf and other places as well. So I think that model that Hive Fund is displaying is a very good example of how philanthropy cannot feel so transactional and stagnant, but really communal and warm. The way the Black community has worked with, and other communities of color have worked with fish fries and car washes and bake sales and everything else, like creating that community, I think is very culturally competent and very culturally sound of the Hive Fund. And I think that's a beautiful thing that you all do over there. So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think it's something that we can all take as an example of how philanthropy can work in a better way, for sure.
Well, thank you. We turned 5 this year, as you know. And so, participatory process, but also deep and true engagement with our partners is really important.
Absolutely.
And we've been on a 5-year journey and know that journey continues to get better and better. I know that you've had other guests who have been on, some of whom are our grantee partners.
Mhm.
And I just remember when we started the Hive Fund in 2019, and I was still very new to philanthropy. We were meeting with partners who I would see all at these philanthropic conferences, and they'd be on every stage. And so I just knew that they were well funded and supported by philanthropy.
Right.
And then I would look at their budget and it would be like, we were the first people to give them like a $50,000 grant. We were
Right.
the first person to make a 3-year commitment to them. And so part of our founding was recognition that organizations that are led by people of color, organizations in the South, organizations that are led by women of color in particular,
Yeah.
have a history of being funded differently, of being funded in that transactional nature, not being looked at as strategic partners. And so we try to start from that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that goes to our next question. You mentioned multi-year grants. You also mentioned smaller organizations. I'm always talking about, folks are like, oh, can an organization of that size handle a grant of this size? And I'm like, well, no, if we never give them the opportunity to, of course they can't, well, it's a cycle. And so you mentioned multi-year grants, funding smaller organizations in a significant way. What are the other changes that foundations can make to realize the vision that you've talked about of this more authentic engagement and communal philanthropy?
I often talk about it. I feel like this feels very Southern, and I am channeling my grandmother, but I talk about it like cake. And I think for too long, particularly people of color, or even people who lead with a justice lens or analysis, have been treated in the climate community as if we are icing on an already baked cake. Like there's a strategy, it is clear, it's already formed. And oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a little bit of this, a drizzle of this, a drizzle of that to set it off? And I think what we believe at the Hive Fund is that the strategy that is going to get us to climate action, to climate progress at the scale and speed that we need, has to have justice at the center. That there's no way to get there cutting these corners around justice. That is why we center our grantee partners as stakeholders and not an afterthought. We don't think that just in this philanthropic space, even though our program staff is all based in the South, they live in the states where they're making grants. It feels really important to name that we're not the smartest people in the room, but also to be not in a one-way conversation, but constantly in a collaborative relationship. is not at the end, just like what's the transaction or what's the grant that I'm going to give you, but actually, how do we view the world? How do we think change happens? What's our analysis around what can happen in Georgia, how that can add up with what can happen in North or South Carolina and Texas and Louisiana, and how does that fit together to not just transform the neighborhood where you may be working, but to really be transformational on a broader level, national, and so many of our partners are also having global impact.
That's wonderful. Drawdown Georgia is about Georgia. And I know you said that we have interviewed a few of your grantee partners this year, which is great. How can the Georgia climate community help? Georgia has many of its own kind of statewide funders that solely fund in the state of Georgia, but also regular folks. Like and then I guess we can also dovetail that question with regular folks wanting to help to support climate solutions around the holidays as well. We know Giving Tuesday is an option in other ways. So how can the Georgia climate community help both from a philanthropic foundation level, but also from, regular folks that want to support climate? How can they help in supporting some of the work that some of your grantee partners and others are doing around the state?
Thank you so much for this question. It's an honor to fund in Georgia, and we are not in Georgia by accident. We're there because we know how critical it is to moving climate progress across the country. We fund in a 7-state region. Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, and the Carolinas are the primary states. And there's a little bit of funding that happens in Alabama and Mississippi as well. But those 7 states together make up about 25% of climate pollution in the US. So if you think about 7 states, a quarter of climate pollution. And so I think a lot of our work is on that front and how people understand, I think through the work of Drawdown Georgia, like what are opportunities to decrease the climate pollution. But Georgia is incredibly important because when we look across the board at states who got millions of dollars to bring new industries online or to create jobs from the Inflation Reduction Act, Georgia's at the top of the list. When we look at the future of energy and what it's going to look like, we look to Georgia, one of the first new nuclear facilities in 20, 30 years. What should we be learning from that? And I know our partners have a lot to say about ratepayers and how they are treated and how they have been treated in the calculus of whether this is a success or not, about what it's meant for their bills, but also about the choice to invest in multi-billion-dollar infrastructure when we have more affordable, more reliable, and distributed options through renewable energy. And so I think that there's a lot to learn through that conversation. I also think that there's a lot to learn through what Georgia has most recently been grappling with, that the state created incentives to draw data centers. And we know that we're living in this age of AI.
Right.
And what we've seen is that has created, or at least been one of the things that the monopoly utility has told us, has created an increased demand that would then require more gas-fired energy production here. And I think that we know that there are alternatives to that, but there's also this opportunity, the specific opportunity in Georgia, because I think there's a lot of building and how do we capture these new industries? But there are lots of opportunities to decrease consumption that start with tried and true basics. So if you look at like the Atlanta metropolitan area, not having ready access to a weatherization assistance program that is located in Metro Atlanta, which is almost 50% of the state. Like if we were to focus on energy efficiency and not even, what else we're building, then there's tremendous strides that could be made here in Georgia. And when we look at Q-Cell, Hyundai, and all these other manufacturers that are coming online, if we look at that as an opportunity to not only shape this new energy economy or have products that are going to be a part of this new energy economy, but also the ground at which labor is going to be negotiated and new labor standards for a growing economy that's going to be the economy of the future. If we look at it, the grounds for which the relationship between neighborhoods and industry are going to be negotiated through like pollution, be it like traditional air pollution or noise pollution, and what we deem as acceptable when making goods we are living through, I've been calling it this renaissance, but it could also be a revolution
Yeah.
where all of these things are being renegotiated. And they're being renegotiated in the South because of the perception that people can do what they want in terms of labor and in terms of environment. And so if our community comes together and says, actually, that's not true, we have a vision for a Georgia that is not only producing clean energy, but that is not polluting and is taking care of these surrounding communities while this is being produced, then that is a paradigm shift that will be felt everywhere else across the country, because every Hyundai that's produced here in Georgia, right, will then be the beneficiary of these agreements with communities or these labor agreements that are shaping and changing, but also it sets the standard for other manufacturing that is yet to come online, that's going to be coming online in South Carolina and North Carolina and Alabama and other parts of the region. One of the things that feels most important in Georgia is there are all these people that are doing work on all of these fronts. And what does it look like for there to be a space and opportunity for them to really come together and take a step back for the big picture?
Yeah.
For us to make sure that equity is baked in. And so it's not an afterthought, but it is part of the strategy, no matter who you are or what sub issue you're working on, that you're really clear about what the equity questions, concerns, considerations are there. And that there's a practice or an ethos of engaging with frontline communities or engaging with communities that are likely to be most impacted by these shifts and these changes. The last thing that I would say is that I think that there's an opportunity for philanthropy to do the same. I know that there's an amazing group of funders across Georgia and even outside Georgia. We were getting together and working really, really closely to come up with a joint strategy. As you all know, coalitions can get
Yeah.
difficult when people's plates get full. And so I think the challenge for us is to do exactly what it is that we want for our partners to do, to make time for really deep strategic coalition and collaboration that centers equity, but also that meets people where they are. Because I think philanthropy has this opportunity to create tables where people can come together outside of this very partisan moment to really think about people and to think about the future. And I think there is a shared future that we want.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the climate and equity grants with Drawdown Georgia that has brought together a number of funders to kind of lay out a pot of funding and supporting that are specifically geared towards climate and equity grants for projects that are geared towards equity first. I think has been really inspiring, and being in some of those conversations, I think that's been really inspiring to see how specific the impact of it on equity has been. And then coupling that with strategies like the Hive Fund has of deep intentional engagement, I think we automatically think philanthropy. How are we looking at the big picture of what we're dealing with, and how are we creating that ecosystem? The money is important. Of course, the funding is important to make things happen and to make sure folks feel supported while they're doing their work. But also, how are we being responsible about the way that we are engaging with the communities as well? And that's not just the community organization's job, that's also philanthropy's part in supporting it in a very specific and equitable way.
Yes. And I think to your point about the work that Drawdown Georgia has done through their equity grants, if there are individuals that are looking to give this season, I think that that's a really great list to look at. I would also direct folks to our website. You can find a state-by-state list of organizations and link through to an opportunity to give. I would be remiss if I did not name that there is a lot of opportunity to give in Augusta right now. It's still reeling from the impacts of Helene. I think I may lean on you all to put a link, and I'll send it to their community foundation that I know is still raising money. I think that so many people come into climate from different vantage points. Ours is really, we're trying to be here for the long haul, because we know that it's going to take a lot of work to live through a transition. But we also know that what we deserve is better on the end of the transition, and not to be dealing with the same issues that we're dealing with this energy system. And we know that we're going to have more Helenes. We know that communities need to be ready. And so I think to be responsive in this moment when communities are still reeling and rebuilding, but also to show up with them as supports to be able to really think about what's next and what it looks like to rebuild in a way that's different, that again centers community and the new reality that we're all living in.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. Can you talk a little bit about what the Hive Fund did when it came to we've already had multiple storms this hurricane season, and hurricane season is getting longer and longer and getting more and more severe. And so that both touched Georgia, as well as, I know you're from North Carolina. I definitely made sure I called on you to make sure you and your people were all right. Can you talk a little bit about the way that the Hive Fund supported both folks in Georgia, but also in the Southeast during this hurricane season? That was, again, is just a microcosm of the larger issue that will continue to get worse and worse, and how you all supported some organizations and how other folks can support them.
Sure. Well, I'll say, first of all, that, we give long-term funding. And so we are not set up to be a rapid response fund. I think one of the great things that we've seen over time is that because of our funding, communities are better connected. I know that we saw in Houston when a storm hit earlier this year that folks were able to activate, some of these networks that have been strengthened through long-term support. They were also able to rely on like some hub homes, which is homes that are designated in areas that have solar and battery that people know that they can go to in those. We don't have that build out yet in Georgia and North Carolina. So our work has really been to reach out to people to see what they need, to make sure that our partners are well positioned. And the goal is for them to have that money because they have a 3-year grant that they can use in flexible ways through general operating support to be responsive in the ways that they need to. One of the things that we did, because North Carolina was especially hit, we, were in relationship with an organization called the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network. And they've just been a partner that we were in relationship with but hadn't funded. And so we brought them in as a funder because they are really convening folks, making sure that if you speak a language that's not English, if you are elderly or disabled, if you are from a community that's hard to get to, that your concerns were also addressed in that immediate rescue kind of period, but also in this now recovery. And they've been really great at elevating issues and concerns and being able to push and change policy, everything from making sure that folks had extended time and more locations to vote, to making sure that people have in-language resources when they're requesting support from FEMA and other resources. And so that's been a place that we've put our dollars. And then we also got some support from our partners at the Clara Lionel Foundation. That is a funder of ours to also make some rapid response grants. And so we were able to move that to some organizations that were just out there already, that we could move it without any application or anything because, it was smaller dollars. So we could either do an amendment to an existing grant. So all they had to do was sign, or they needed to just send us their 501c3 paperwork. I think one of our goals has always been, how can we, yes, do everything that we need to do to make sure that things are in line with the IRS, but how can we really streamline it so that we're not burdening people unduly? And what we saw, particularly in 2020, is that philanthropy can do things differently.
Yes.
And I think we've tried to take that into 2024, and we will take it with us beyond. But I think that that's one of the things that philanthropy can do, is really call on those lessons from 2020. We've seen some of them revert back. We've seen some of them get even more stringent. If we can do it in a COVID moment, if we can do it in a racial reckoning moment, then that means that we can do it, and it can be our general practice. Exactly. And so that's one of the things that we try to push in philanthropy.
Exactly. So true. And that has been my major gripe with philanthropy. And I have not been quiet about it. So it won't come to surprise anybody, but, being really transformative in the way that we are funding, I say this all the time, and I think it makes some people nervous, but like, the rules are made up, y'all. Like, we're making them up, so we can change them in a lot of ways. Just because this is the way that we've done things doesn't mean it always has to be the way that we do things. And so we saw that in 2020, where there wasn't an opportunity to do things the way that we had always done them. We had to get creative. So we can continue to do so, to your point. And I think that's so important to mention. So thank you for highlighting. And I wanted to make sure that we shouted out the work that the Hive Fund and other folks have done when it comes to this hurricane season. It's something that we will continue to see. My last question to you, it's my favorite question that we ask all of our interviewees. What's giving you hope? What's giving you hope around climate and environmental justice movement in Georgia? what's giving you hope around the work the Hive Fund is doing? What is giving you hope? What is fueling you right now? It's been a heavy year for all of us in many ways. We like to end on a hopeful note. What is keeping you going, and what is giving you hope in this moment?
That is such a great question. I was thinking about this earlier, and there is so much, it feels difficult to narrow, but I'll say that it is like the vast array of people that are working on this issue. I know you all had Dr. McLean on a previous episode. So I'll say elders to Black girl environmentalists who are Gen Z, but there are all these different approaches, these different voices to climate action, I think, that are all going to be necessary to move us forward. And so seeing the broad spectrum is what is giving me hope. I think I'm also so hopeful because we are in now and maybe coming into the moment of being able to invest in innovation in a very specific way. And it was with the knowledge that some federal funding would be coming, and what would it look like for community partners to put forth their own vision and build out their own vision for what equitable, accessible, renewable energy would look like. And we have so many partners that have built new skills now that have been able to do that. And so I think we're going to be entering a period of a different type of innovation, but that every time we ask or come to a challenge and, bring some resources and say, hey, what should we be doing? That folks have answers. They've been thinking about this thing. They've been building it in the background. They didn't think that anyone cared. And so I think that there's so much energy and opportunity. And I think that that's going to continue to be the case, no matter kind of what's happening at the meta level. And I think the other thing that really gives me hope is that particularly Southern people have had the recent experience, got a long experience, but the recent experience of building locally, building at the state level with some challenging conditions. And, they're ready. They've been doing it. And so I think what gives me hope is that I know that we're going to keep doing it.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot on this show about how creative Georgians are when it comes to, I think the South gets a bad rap when it comes to climate and climate solutions, but Georgians are creative. And many strides have been made in the face of, situations or governments that maybe haven't leaned on climate in the same way. But we also know that Georgia's really big on environmental energy efficiency and Georgia's really big on things like that. So yeah, we can say on one hand, the South gets a bad rap on not being innovative in that way. And yet your Dr. McLean's and other organizations have made it happen. All the organizations that we've interviewed so far this year in the interview series have made it happen. I think you're absolutely right. And I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much.
You as well.
Thank you so much for bringing your thought process. I love talking to Black women in philanthropy. I think it's such an interesting space to be in and such an interesting identity to hold in that space. But I know it's not easy. And so I appreciate the work that you do. And I just appreciate and adore you, as you know. Thank you, Melanie Allen, so much for being with us today and for cluing us in on your insightful view of the philanthropic community. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us this year. Thank you for joining us for this interview series. And we hope to see you again soon. And we hope that you will definitely check out all the other episodes that we have up on our YouTube channel. And hopefully there's more to come. Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you, Eriqah. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you for this series where I've gotten to hear from so many amazing voices. And happy holidays to you all.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.